Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining from across the country. I can see the virtual room is filling up, which is exciting. We're thrilled to have over 1,000 people registered for this morning's session. So we'll just give it a moment for folks to pour into the virtual room and we'll get things going. I want to welcome you again to our event, Canada's Net Zero Future, Finding Our Way in a Global Transition. And thrilled to be working on behalf of Globe, powering this event for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. My name is Elizabeth Shirt. I'm Managing Director of Globe Series. I'm thrilled to let you know that today's event is available in both English and French. To adjust your language, you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Cet événement est disponible en anglais et en français. Pour ajuster votre langue au français, cliquez sur l'icône représentant une globe en bas de votre écran. And that is all the French you'll hear from me today. So I do encourage you to use that interpretation and listen in the language of your choice. Before we kick off today, I want to acknowledge that I have the privilege of joining you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also known as Vancouver. And I'd like to invite you now to reflect on the land you're joining from. You can get flexing that interactivity muscle that we'll be using over the course of the session by letting us know in the chat the details on the connection you feel with the place that you live or another place that you feel connected to. So I'd invite you to do that now using the chat function. Globe prides itself in holding tough conversations. We convene a wide variety of perspectives, and we bring together forums for meaningful discussion and action. With hundreds, maybe over 1,000 attendees on the line today, we're bound to disagree on some of what we talk about regarding Canada's net zero future. We welcome debate and honest dialogue. And what we ask is that you engage with one another respectfully while we're together over the next hour. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome your host of this event, Kathy Bartzwick, President of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Kathy, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and welcome all. Good morning to some, good afternoon to some, and actually good evening to some. As I was scanning the participant list, I noticed that there are folks coming from all over the world, including India. So clearly there is indication that this conversation that we're about to have, we collectively believe is an important one. Either that or it's Friday and you haven't had your sufficient quota of Zoom, which I will assume is actually not the case. Over the next hour, we are going to delve more deeply into this discussion about the potential nature of that journey. But first, we want to get your mind and your heart and your head into our virtual conference room. And we're going to do that by posting a poll question for you to get you into the net zero mental space. So the poll question is, and I will read it, what do you think are the most important technology priorities for Canada to pursue through policy and investment on the path to net zero? Now, choose up to 3. This is multiple choice. And you will notice that while technology certainly does play a role in nature-based solutions, we have included nature-based solutions in this list as well, even though we've referred to technology priorities. So please provide your answers. And again, up to 3. But please keep it to 3 so that we get a sense of the thematics that are coming out in terms of the audience and where your headspace is today. And those choices: energy efficiency, electrification, heat pumps, electric vehicles, renewable electricity, nature-based solutions, hydrogen, and bioenergy. So let's see what we've got here. Oh, interesting. We've got a vying of the top 3 with energy efficiency improvements, electrification, heat pumps, vehicles, renewable electricity, and then we've got nature-based solutions coming in fourth, a close fifth with hydrogen and bioenergy. Well, that's interesting, and we're going to return to this question towards the end of the session, but hopefully it's gotten your headspace to be centered on net zero, and that you have now joined us in our virtual room. So now on to the agenda, and here's a rundown of what we plan to do with you over the next hour. We're first going to hear from Jason Dion, Mitigation Research Director with the Climate Choices and lead author of a report that we recently released outlining possible pathways for Canada as it journeys to 2050 with milestones along the way, of course, most notably 2030. Now, Jason is going to summarize this 127-page report in 6 minutes. And so he's really only going to hit the highlights and set the stage for what will follow. And what will follow is an opportunity to hear from 4 folks who have agreed to join us on a panel. I'm going to begin by asking them a number of questions. And then I'm going to ask 2 of our audience members to join me to ask some additional questions. And then it's your turn. And you'll have an opportunity to have your questions asked of the panelists. Now, Elizabeth already referred to the chat function. I would encourage you to use the chat beginning anytime now. And I would also highlight that we do have Climate Choices staff who are going to be monitoring the chat. And if there is opportunity to respond to questions that you've posted more immediately, rather than wait to the end of the session, we will do that. And what we're also going to do, and please recognize that with over 1,000 people, we most likely will not get to all of your questions, but we'll do our best to create themes associated with what you're posting so that we can get to as many of your questions as possible. So that's the lay of the land for what we're going to take you through for the remaining time that we have with you. So without further ado, over to Jason, please.
Thanks very much, Kathy. So I'll start with a quick background of what we've done in this report and how it came together. So we've taken a look at over 60 different scenarios of how Canada could get to net zero, different pathways. And we've really designed these to reflect uncertainty and the role of drivers that will affect that transition that include things inside Canada's control, but also outside Canada's control. So these include things like the extent and pace of climate policy adoption in other major countries, the cost of key GHG reducing technologies, future global oil demand and prices, and even the availability and cost of negative emissions technologies. So together, these scenarios were designed to reflect the larger possibility space that exists around how that transition might play out. And what we've done in the report is, rather than looking individually at all of these scenarios, instead, we tend to zoom out and look across all of them to ask, well, what's consistent? What, regardless of how that transition plays out, what shows up again and again? And where there are differences, what are the drivers of those differences? So a big report and a lot of ground to cover, but there's 2 main findings that I wanted to highlight here to seed the discussion among the panelists. So if we could get that first slide up. The first is what we observe in the report and the analysis around safe bets and wildcards. So safe bets are those solutions and technologies that are commercially available today and have no major constraints to scaling them up. So things that we have in hand. They're also the things that we define as showing up consistently across all of our scenarios. So they're the things that no matter how that transition plays out, they're there, driving a really important role in terms of GHG reductions. Now we can distinguish the safe bets from the wildcards. Wildcards are solutions and technologies that are demonstration stage only, so they're early days yet, or where they are commercially available, where there are questions around how scalable they might prove to be. Now, these wildcards only play a role in our analysis under particular conditions. So let's be a bit more specific about what we're including there, if we could move to the next slide. So what we have in this next slide is GHG reductions in the year 2030. And each of the bubbles that you see represents the contribution to the reductions that are going on. The darker portion of the circle is the minimum that we see when we look across all of our scenarios in terms of the contribution. And that larger area of the circle is the larger potential that might exist. So we see that in a subset of our scenarios. Now, the real big takeaway here is that we find that safe bets when it comes to hitting that 2030 target on the path to net zero can drive a minimum of 2/3 of the reductions needed to get to that first target. In some of our scenarios, it's as much as 90%. Some wildcards are also there, but they're playing a more minor role by 2030. So the big takeaway here is that safe bets are critical to that 2030 target. These are things that we have in hand today. So it's a matter of their deployment and their uptake. And they play a big role no matter how all those uncertain variables that I was talking about at the beginning play out. So they're things we can move forward with confidence. They are even important when the wildcards are working out in a big way. So even in the best case scenario for wildcards, safe bets are critical, especially to that 2030 target. So if we can move to the next slide, we can now switch this view to ask about, well, what does it look like in 2050? So the first thing to observe, of course, is that the bubbles are bigger. So we're making deeper reductions to get to that net zero target. And we can see that the safe bets are growing in terms of the contribution that they're making. So they're still a really important engine of GHG reductions. But the wildcards are playing a much larger but more uncertain role by 2050. So things like next generation biofuels and RNG made with different feedstocks than we make them with today. Hydrogen, advanced types of carbon capture and sequestration are all playing perhaps a really major and important role, but an uncertain one, given how the uncertainty around how their costs might evolve and other barriers. Direct air capture, a technology that could suck carbon dioxide right out of the air to bury it underground, we can sort of think of as the ultimate wildcard. It could change everything or it could change nothing. So a lot of uncertainty there, but an important possibility to note. Now, the big takeaway here in this slide is that wildcards are critical to unlocking the deeper, cost-effective reductions needed to get to that net zero target, but they come with more uncertainty. And that's part of the reason that we recommend a portfolio approach around them, that we pursue a number of them to try to tap the benefits and opportunities that they could present, but without betting the house on any of them, given that uncertainty. So just one more finding I wanted to highlight for you folks, and that is about the destination of what a net zero Canada and net zero energy systems in Canada could actually look like. So if we could move to the next slide. And what we find here is that there's actually 3 possible different net zero energy systems for a country like Canada. And you can see them here on the slide. Now, Canada is unique in having so many options, and it's by virtue of our landmass, our resources, our infrastructure. Now, these are all possible energy systems for Canada. That does not mean that they're equally likely. So some would certainly come with more barriers than others. At the same time, they would also all have to overcome significant barriers. So there's no easy answers here when it comes to scaling any of these up in a big way. Now, in the report, we spent a lot of time talking about the pros and cons of each of these, a lot of the specific barriers. I'll just note here in the interest of time that for the first 2, it's really a matter of major technological barriers, the costs and scalability of negative emissions technologies, the viability and costs of those second generation biofuels. Now, certainly some technical barriers in that third system, but the barriers tend to be more a matter of logistics and infrastructure is more the kind of the challenges with a system like that and scaling it up. Now, a mix of these is entirely possible. So we might see different sectors, different regions adopting different types of energy systems. And in fact, we see a mix in some of our scenarios. So different uptake of these in different places and parts of the economy. In particular, that third energy system of electrification plus hydrogen grows in all of our scenarios. So even when negative emissions technologies are working out in a big way, second generation biofuels in a big way, that electrification plus hydrogen system is growing. So an important finding there. Now, the big takeaway here is that Canada has options and even advantages when it comes to moving to a net zero energy system. But we're going to have to make some strategic choices and investments. At the same time, the final result is not going to be an entirely domestic decision. Canada's net zero energy system or mix of systems will ultimately be determined by factors that are in our control, so our domestic policy choices, infrastructure, land use priorities, but also factors outside of it, including investment decisions happening abroad and political and market conditions around the world. So managing risk and uncertainty is going to be the name of the game. a key question here is, well, what do we think then is most likely, given many of the barriers that I've described and that we describe in the report, how other barriers might come about in the future that would also need to be overcome. And beyond the question of what we think is most likely, what do we think is most desirable? And that's a much bigger question. So what do we want to pursue across safe bets and wildcards, across energy systems, given Canada's potential comparative advantages, export opportunities, and the type of energy systems we're looking to adopt at home? So really big questions there, and ones that Canadians are going to have to wrestle with. And I thought a useful place to sort of start this and seed this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. I was noticing in the chat as Jason was speaking that there was quite a flurry of activity asking about the report itself, downloads, access to materials, and you can take a look at the posting in the chat for the report itself, and you can also go to the Climate Choices website where we have the report and supporting materials for that. So I noticed quite a few questions in that respect. Okay, so let's move on to our panel. I am really pleased to be able to introduce the four panelists to you now. I'll first introduce David Patterson. David is Vice President, Corporate and Environmental Affairs with General Motors Canada. We also have Graham Reed. Graham is Senior Advisor for the Assembly of First Nations. We have John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President, Office of the CEO with Royal Bank of Canada. And finally, we were to have Martha Hall-Finley, Chief Sustainability Officer with Suncor, but Martha has at the 11th hour been called away by Premier Kenney. And so her colleague, John Mitchell, Vice President Sustainability, is pinch hitting for her. Welcome to the four of you. Now, let's get you warmed up. I'm going to ask all four of you this first question, and that will get the pumps primed. So we've witnessed deep decarbonization commitments globally, now having been made by basically all significant major economies, with the most recent being the Biden administration's move. In fact, just last week or the week before, Biden clearly and I think quite aggressively stated that the race was on with China to ensure that the US capitalized on and leveraged the opportunities of a global move to a net zero future. And I think he left no question that he plans on winning that race. So what about Canada's race? As you think about the chapters that our country must write to achieve 2030, and ultimately the story that we need to write to achieve the commitment that we have declared for a 2050 net zero, what comes to mind, using Jason's vernacular of safe bets and wildcards? What comes to mind through your lens in terms of where those priorities need to be? Where are the safe bet priorities that you think we need to be focused on? And where do we need to be more courageous and take those wild card bets that Jason is also suggesting in the report are going to be critically important if we are to achieve 2050? Let me start with you, David. Through the critically important lens of transportation, clearly, these are some significant challenges for the transportation industry. So what do you think?
Thanks, Kathy. Well, I was very pleased in the report to see that that all our on-road vehicles were a very safe bet in terms of getting to carbon neutrality. Sometimes I lose a little sleep over that, but really proud to work at General Motors, where we've sort of declared our plan to be only selling fully electric vehicles in our light duty fleet at year 2035, and to be carbon neutral at 2040. But getting there has some really significant challenges that we're going to have to take on, not just in Canada, but we're part of a very integrated continental business in the automotive sector. But you know, we have 30 million cars on the road in Canada, one for practically every voter in Canada, put it that way. And so turning over that fleet of vehicles and at the rate that people buy them and adopt the new technology, and to educate them and support them to move into battery electric vehicles. And then a big task on us in the auto industry to be able to get the cost of those vehicles and the cost of batteries down so that it's actually more affordable to buy an electric car than it is to buy an internal combustion engine. That's our challenge. But I think there'll be some huge opportunities if we do it together with the United States, for Canada with its mining sector and all of those aspects. So I think we can get there, but there's going to be some policy choices along the way. And I sure hope we make them, because we're making a big bet in our future that we're going to make our way to that all electric future by 2035.
So David, I hold that thought, because I do want to come back and have you articulate more directly what you think those policy choices need to include. But let me bring other panelists into this. So let's go to you, Graham. Through the lens of this substantial work and the results that are being achieved, but the major challenges that remain within Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. What are your thoughts when you think about this concept of safe bets and wild cards?
Yeah, miigwech, Kathy and Anine, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you, and I'd be remiss not to acknowledge two things: just the health pandemic that we're all suffering through, which I think in this conversation is particularly important, and also the lands that I'm joining on, which is the unceded, unsurrendered lands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And as a guest, this acknowledgement is not just about words, but it's about this protocol and process of building a more respectful and caring relationship with the land and where I'm living. And I feel like, these are important parallels that are often missed within this conversation on net zero. How do we conceptualize net zero? Canada is not an end state, but a process towards a more just, equitable, and resilient future for all of our little ones, yours and mine, and all of those who are not on the line. And these are, I think, important ways in which we reframe this conversation to focus, what's inherently about people and land and reciprocity, and that relationship between those three and the nexus of those three are essential to contextualizing the definition of net zero. And I think, one of the things that are important in how do we bring in, Indigenous worldviews, epistemologies, and ontologies is really understanding that this requires us to kind of step back and really define net zero from different places and different worldviews. And I feel like, the overwhelming tendency is to essentially get it to a point where we're stopping, kind of balancing out our emissions from kind of reducing that from other, sequestration or reforestation or other purposes. And I feel like the opportunity that we have now mapping out the next 30 years is really getting to a point where we're building that future, that just, equitable, and resilient future based on a definition that also addresses kind of reparations with each other, with the land, and with kind of all of society. And only then can we really get to that space where we're empowering, communities, whether at the local, the regional, or the nation level, to self-determine their own solutions. And when thinking about that in the context of how we characterize safe bets and wildcards, it kind of speaks to the importance of embedding, this equity and rights-based lens to that. And how are we thinking about really examining, the over-reliance on technology and markets to address problems that, to a certain degree have been caused by technology and markets, the overwhelming tendency to extract resources, extract labor, extract women, all of which I think are important framings for this conversation, especially given, how we're all discussing this topic. And so I hope that, through bringing these different worldviews, we can think about how climate is no longer separate from our daily lives and experiences, and the kind of privilege that all of us on the panel are expressing, whether through kind of our socioeconomic status, our academic status, our job status, all of which is essential to, how do we really envision that future that is just, equitable, and resilient. So.
Thank you, Graham. John Mitchell, I want to bring you into this now. Clearly, with energy being such a foundational, fundamental discussion point in all of this. Your industry has been suggesting that we need more certainty here. We need a better sense of how this is going to unfold and what levels of support are going to be required. This debate associated with the role of the industry and the role it should play or it can play to contribute to achieving our emissions objectives, and how we balance that need with the need to ensure that we're leveraging new opportunity and divestment or diversification strategies. And that tug and pull is a very important conversation, one that needs to be held up in the light of day. So when you're thinking about this concept of safe bets and wild cards through the lens of your industry, what's top of mind for you?
Thanks, Kathy, and pleasure to join everybody today. I think a couple of things. When I first looked at the report and saw sort of the safe bets and wild cards framing, I have to admit I had a bit of a strong reaction to that structure, because it felt to me like we were preferencing one approach versus the other. But of course, when you get into that report, you realize that that's not what's being suggested. It is sort of a full portfolio of strategies to pursue both the safe bets and the wild cards. And as I extend sort of the analogy of the hand that we're being dealt and the safe bets and wild cards, and any of the games that I've ever played that use wild cards, some of those tend to be the most powerful cards in the game. And so I think that that's an important framing for this particular discussion, because when I look at the structure that's in front of us, or the options that are in front of us, and what the report does, it recognizes that the energy sector and our business, it has to play an incredibly important role in getting to our net zero targets. If we don't, then I think our chances of success are much lower. And so when I look at what does that mean from a nation perspective, it's not much different than how I look at it from a company like ours. We're engaged in all parts of the energy system, oil and gas, power, and interactions with the customers on both of those fronts. And so when I look at what's necessary, the report highlights a couple of things that are very real and meaningful for us as well. How do we decarbonize the existing part of the economy? And how do we grow new lines of business or new parts of the economy that are lower carbon? And so if I look at the safe bets or the wild cards, the ones that jump off the page for me are in our base business or in the existing parts of the economy. What can we do to drive and really accelerate energy efficiency more than we've been able to achieve so far? What do we do on fuel switching? How do we change the fuels that we're using to power either the company or our economy to lower carbon fuels? And what role does CCS play, particularly for us to deal with some of those harder to abate emissions? So that helps within the base business. And if I look at, well, that in and of itself isn't enough. What do we need to do to grow the low carbon parts of our business or the economy? And if I look at low carbon power production, obviously a huge lever for us to pull and accelerate. Low carbon fuels, whether that's biofuels and first generation, second generation, even more importantly to accelerate. And then what role does hydrogen play? And I think if I look at that from our perspective, we're a huge consumer and producer of hydrogen today. How do we decarbonize that? How do we grow the markets that will allow us to expand and accelerate that production in the future? So when I look at the safe bets and wild cards, I don't tend to separate them in the same way. I think they present different opportunities, but they are both part of a really important and robust portfolio going forward.
Terrific. Thank you, John. And certainly last but not least, John Stackhouse, there is no question that global capital is shifting. It's shifting quickly. The momentum is clear. And it plays such a significant role globally in this global transition. Your thoughts, please.
That's a great way to frame it, Kathy. Let me start first of all by thanking and congratulating you and Jason and the team for pulling together this event. The sheer number of people on the call is an indication of how engaging this conversation is in Canada, and the report was really helpful to helping a lot of us kind of understand the complexities, but also the opportunities to take on what I would call a portfolio approach to this, and that speaks to the capital challenge. And I think it's very important for Canadians to understand that when we're developing a net zero strategy, particularly, it is going to take a portfolio of investments. And when you go about a portfolio approach to investments, you have a range, as Jason's report illustrates, and that includes a range of risks. That works because it is a portfolio, and not everything in the portfolio is going to work out the way you anticipate it to. And I hope that's very helpful for Canadians to just get on with a lot of this, knowing that some things are not going to work out the way we anticipate it to. But if we have a portfolio collectively, odds of success are very good. The second part of a portfolio approach that investors would be looking for is just to get going with things. So to have the policy framework, we've largely got that in this country. And now just get going with it. Don't try to have the whole portfolio designed before you roll it out. Things that are going to be built in 2035, we can get to. Let's get going with what we can build in 2021 while starting to plan towards those things, and not let perfection of the whole portfolio get in our way. A couple of other points I would make from an investor point of view, Kathy, is the competition is growing, and it's probably growing by the day. And we cannot be unmindful of that as Canadians, particularly in the US. And this is not just an outcome of the Biden election. As the US comes out of this downturn, let's not forget how incredible an innovation machine that economy is, with science, with R&D, but really powerful on the D side. And when they decide to get going with something, they scale in a real hurry. So we're going to have to be on our best game. One might say the same of Europe, but we're seeing a lot of activity start to get going in the US. That's very exciting from a global perspective, but I think maybe a bit of a fire under our feet here in Canada. In other words, we can't spend too much time talking versus investing and getting going with some of these ideas. So those are a few of the quick thoughts I'd insert into the conversation.
So John, that's an excellent segue into wanting to return to the point that David had made related to policy decision making and priority setting. And your point is excellent, John. And this is what we've got to really keep in the forefront, is that we've got to get moving. And we're spending an awful lot of time talking about possibility and talking about potential and talking about barrier, but we've got to get moving. So David, I want to return to you. You had identified the need to be clearer and have a clearer line of sight into those policy choices and priorities that are going to enable quicker progress and deeper progress. And you suggested, I think, given that there are 30 million combustible engines on the road, that there is this huge paradigm shift required. What needs to be true? Where do those public policy priorities need to be focused?
Kathy, and I like the comments from everybody on the panel on this, because I totally agree with John. You just got to get going. But in some areas, time is not our friend. It takes time to move through these things, and a combination of the innovation economy and investment together with the right policy tools, both carrots and sticks, sometimes make a big difference. And the one that I'm most knowledgeable about is definitely in the automotive sector. It's one of the bubbles that's highest on the chart, and so I'll speak to that quickly. I think there's, in terms of us accelerating the adoption of zero emission vehicles, and by the way, we should not, I would probably be intending to move the hydrogen into the left-hand side of the chart a little more than it is. I think there's great potential for hydrogen vehicles, especially for long haulers and others where maybe the degree of infrastructure is not as important. We shouldn't be waiting around to get going on that. And in fact, we're doing some of that for large semi-trailers now ourselves. But in terms of the 12% of our greenhouse gases that come from all those 30 million cars on the road, you know, we need to turn over the fleet. And to do that and be able to, you know, and keep in mind, we only turn over with new vehicles about 6% of that fleet every year. And of the 6%, we only sell 3% electric vehicles of the 6%. So just do the math. What we need to do is accelerate that equation. So how do we do that? I think what we feel is, number one, we have a big job in the auto sector, and it's a technology job, and it has to do with battery development and being able to use own your chemistry and be able to develop batteries that will allow a vehicle to go further at less cost. It's the classic engineering challenge that we have, and get to that very important thing of price parity, so that the cost of making an electric vehicle is about the same as an internal combustion engine or less. Because if you can do that, I think customers are going to charge towards those, no pun or pun intended, and they are going to find it's cheaper to operate their vehicles. They are infinitely more fun to drive. And we are going to really see that take off. But to get there, we're going to continue to need incentives for our consumers in the marketplace and see those more aggressive. We had a little fun with Will Ferrell on the Super Bowl talking about how Norway is already at about a 50% adoption level. And here we are at 3% in Canada. There are things that governments can do with incentives, like free parking. Wouldn't it be great if your toll road was free? Wouldn't it be great if when you registered your car, it didn't cost you anything? There's many policy levers that can be much more creatively applied, as well as just giving a check to someone to buy an electric vehicle. But we need to make that adoption quicker. Clearly, we need to work on the charging network. We need to be able to get people's ability to charge up a vehicle at the same time frame as it takes to fill your gasoline tank up. And we can do that, but it's going to take some more innovation. And we're also going to need to work through, on a continental basis, our regulatory environment. And I look forward to the day where we can put fuel economy regulations in the rearview mirror, because they won't apply to us. We'll have nothing but electric vehicles with zero emissions. And I think that time is coming fairly rapidly. So we need to work together on that. And in the meantime, while we're doing it, we should create a nice legacy of a very strong mining industry in Canada that's going to help us build all those batteries. So there's a huge economic development opportunity as well.
Thank you. John Mitchell, I'd like to bring you back into this as well, given the theme here related to urgency. I know your industry is certainly aware that it has been suggested you're moving too slow in terms of the path that you're on. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the whole world's been moving too slow. Canada's been moving too slow, and the sector is slow as well. But I think what I'm encouraged by is the momentum and the pace that we've seen over the last year. So if we go back a year from now, just as we were heading into the COVID crisis and the economic shock and health shock that came associated with that, in years past, we would have seen sort of an economic downturn like that. We would have seen attention on energy transition and climate wane. but we didn't. And that's incredibly encouraging to me, because we saw a continued focus on government and industry commitment to net zero. We saw a continued focus on this idea that we can mobilize the capital necessary to make these transitions throughout the downturn as we recover. And I think that's a fundamental shift in what's happening now versus what's happened before. And even when I look at a company like ours, we're coming into, still a very challenging capital environment, but the projects that we're bringing back on, 10% of our capital this year are going to energy transition type projects, and are focused on, building new renewable power, doing fuel switching and lowering the carbon emissions associated with our base business. So those kind of things may not have happened before, but they're happening now, and they're happening at a greater rate than they were in the past. I think David's made some great points around the policy challenges that we've got in the country to really mobilize the sector, the energy sector broadly, to step into this space. You look at the complexity of the electricity regulatory infrastructure that we've got in the country. We put a cross-country fast charging vehicle network into Petro-Canada stations from coast to coast, but we're still challenged to navigate the regulatory environment on how we price that product and engage the customers in that transition. And so we've got work to do to clear up some of these policy barriers that get in the way. And I think John made a great point earlier about this isn't about saying, here's your recipe. Here's everything you need to do to get to net zero. This is about creating the conditions to successfully navigate that path, because we don't know what the path is today. We need to discover what it is and try a bunch of things. Some won't work, some will. But I think what we've heard from a number of people on the panel already is the exciting part is that we're moving very quickly on that journey. So maybe I'll pause there. I know we're tight on time.
Yeah, I can't believe how quickly the time is going. I'm going to ask that we have our audience members join us, who are going to be asking some questions as well, if I may. I want to first introduce Megan Poss to the group. Megan is Executive Director of Leading Change Canada. Megan, please ask your question of our panelists. Megan, you're muted. Okay, there you go.
Great, sorry about that. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, panelists. I'd love to pick up on one of Graham's earlier comments on approaching net zero from different worldviews and building a just, equitable, and resilient future. So the organization I represent, Leading Change Canada, we support youth and young sustainability professionals across the country, many of whom come from backgrounds or communities that are typically underrepresented in positions of Canadian leadership and decision making. I suspect many or most amongst us are acutely aware that the negative manifestations of climate change, both what we've already seen and what's foreseeable, haven't impacted all Canadians fairly or equally. Factors such as age, race, gender, disability, geographic location, and of course, access to wealth and savings can all limit one's ability to ride out the proverbial and unfortunately, in some cases, literal storms. So I'm curious to hear from the panelists where you see obligations as well as the opportunities in the transition to a net zero economy for including those groups disproportionately impacted by climate change. And in particular, if you have any thoughts on young people who will be both heavily impacted by climate change and also look to for managing and leading those net zero solutions as we approach 2050.
Thank you, Megan. So Graham, you were referenced in this question, so I'm going to ask you to respond first.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy, and I appreciate, Megan, your question. Something that obviously speaks very closely to my heart. And, it's interesting that that we seem to fall in this common trope where we actually avoid that angle of the conversation when talking about net zero. And that's why hopefully, some of the points that I had raised kind of resonate with folks, in our virtual circle, because, we really need to step back and ask, is the future that we want replacing 30 million cars with 30 million cars? And is the future that we want single vehicle ownership for every single person that we have? And I feel like, that sort of like privileged question and kind of proposal for what that future looks like is like a weird manifestation of who's on this panel and who's talking about these issues. And so I think we really need to be careful with how we set up and how we frame who needs to be in the room and who needs to decide what that future looks like. And it speaks to, how are we co-building and empowering, those different concentric circles of decision making to imagine their net zero in their own way. And I kind of challenge John's point a little bit about, let's rely on wildcards. I think the entire premise of the report was by 2030 we don't need to do that, right? Like, why are we continuously putting all of our time and efforts in things that don't exist yet, even though we know what could help us reduce our emissions now? And part of, doing that, it reminds me of an elder that I work with quite often about, talking about how do we approach these things in the most simplest way. And for me, that, kind of acknowledges what's causing these issues to begin with, and how do we address that through the design of policy interventions to address that, while at the same time, how do we kind of move climate away from this privileged, non-representational conversation towards, as Megan kind of put, those who are on the front lines, those who recognize that climate is not separate from, inequality, it's not separate from racial injustice, it's not separate from Indigenous injustice, it's not separate from, socioeconomic status. And so hopefully, at least when we see this conversation, we can start to get to that future where this is one that avoids the kind of common tropes of climate discourse and the kind of privileged nature of what that looks like. And, for example, we know that subsidies for net zero emission cars are not, or zero emission cars are not the most equitable solution, right? We have research now that talks about, e-bikes as a more equitable solution to transport within cities. So hopefully, through that lens of equity and rights-based, we can get to the solutions that, really, I think resonate with, those who are being disproportionately impacted by this conversation. And I'll close, like, one thing that often comes to mind is this kind of, I guess, phrase common within the climate justice movement. It's, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And I feel like this conversation is just an important opportunity, and the next 30 years is a more important opportunity to really kind of examine why we're not in the same boat and how do we address that inequality. And I can go on, but I really appreciate that question, Megan, and I think it's really important for how we all think about these solutions.
Terrific. And I'm going to bemoan the fact that unfortunately we've got to move on to our next audience question. I know, Megan, other panelists would love to have a chance to say more as well, but we do need to move on. I'm going to introduce Priyanka Lloyd now. And Priyanka is the Executive Director of Green Economy Canada. Priyanka, yes, I see you. Welcome. Please ask your question. You are on mute. Oh, good. Now you're not.
Yeah, just took a...
Oh, you're on mute again.
Oh, there we go. The host muted me. I'm back. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So at Green Economy Canada, we lead a network of 300 businesses and organizations who are interested in taking climate action and seizing the benefits of a low carbon economy. 85% of these organizations are small and medium-sized enterprises, a demographic that represents 99% of businesses in Canada and employs almost 9 in 10 private sector workers. SMEs face significant barriers to engaging in the low carbon transition. Namely, they often lack the time, knowledge, and resources that larger organizations have to undertake this work. While the existence of safe bets is encouraging, the reality is that the majority of businesses in Canada don't know what their carbon footprint is, where best to focus their emission reduction efforts, or even what net zero might mean. So I was wondering if the panelists could speak to how we might need to think differently about the supports, incentives, and financing businesses and local communities receive so that we increase the likelihood of meeting our goals, ensure SMEs don't get left behind, and can help the average business relate to what a net zero future means. And specifically, if you could each speak to how you plan to support your SME vendors, partners, and clients to meet our 2030 and 2050 goals.
Okay, thank you, Priyanka. And I'd love to get all four to speak, but I'm going to start with you, John Stackhouse, please.
No, thank you. It's a great question. And we're doing a lot of work on climate literacy and trying to develop new tools, as are others in the country, that can help both individuals but organizations, SMEs at the forefront, understand things like climate or carbon footprints, but also the efficiency opportunities here. And I can just maybe bridge this to the last question. Too often we talk about the energy transition as a burden. And there's an enormous economic opportunity for individuals as well as producers, companies, agriculture producers, to better manage their energy costs, which is a significant input in this country. You know that on a day like today, just from the burden of cold. If we can become much more efficient with energy as an input cost, we will become much more efficient as an economy, as communities, as households. And the savings will go principally to lower income households, which spend far too much of a household budget. It's about 10% on energy costs, as well as to those SMEs that you referenced. You think, from a small factory to an agriculture producer to a restaurant, the amount of their income that they have to spend on energy costs can be managed down much more efficiently through a lot of the options that we've been discussing. So we're keen on that conversation, keen to help our clients and community partners understand the opportunities here that will make them, whether it's a household or an SME, as you reference, able to manage their finances better. But use some of those savings for kind of more, I don't want to say more productive, but for other things that they may want to spend money on, including innovation for the SMEs.
Thank you, John. I'm going to open it up to anyone else who would like to wade into this question. We do have a couple of minutes. And while you're thinking about whether you want to put your hand up or not, let me assure the audience I've been trying to do my best to reflect some of the themes that are coming through in the chat. Not doing a very good job, clearly, because of our time constraints, but doing the best I can to try to inject some of the thematic that's coming through the chat. But I'm also noticing, and this is wonderful, that you're chatting with each other, which is also one of the objectives of this session. So kudos to the audience for having really engaged in speaking with each other in the chat function. David, Graham, John's got his hand up. John, please.
Oh, looks like David and I were competing with our hands waving at each other, but I'll try to be a little bit quick. And I want to respond quickly to the first question, just to clarify some of my remarks. I want to make sure I don't leave the impression that we should be relying on wildcards. That's not the message I was trying to deliver. What I was trying to say is that both are critically important. There's a lot of safe bets. There's a lot of things we can accelerate and move now. But there's also a number of things in the wildcard spot that I think are actually closer than may have been conveyed in some of the reports. So things like hydrogen, that's staring us right in the face today. And I think there's some real opportunities there. So I think when we mobilize the private sector to really invest and to tackle this challenge, we're gonna move those things between wildcards and safe bets all the time. And so I'm less fussed about sort of the label that we put on them, more interested in making sure we're advancing a really robust portfolio to get to this goal. And so I just wanted to make sure that was the case. Now, getting back into the SME question, I think there's a really important trend that's going on. And when we're talking about, when we hear companies and groups talk about their scope 3 emissions, that includes their suppliers and the small and medium-sized organizations that they work with. And so we have a very specific vested interest in that. One is, yes, can we help those communities and those companies really help tackle their emissions? But also when we're thinking about the growing risk on a cost basis of the inputs to our business, I need to know what the emissions intensity of the products and things are that I'm buying, because they could go up when carbon prices go up. So we have a vested interest in helping our supply chain meet these targets and these demands as well. So there is an absolute opportunity for us to work with those suppliers to help them understand their own emissions in order to get to our goals, but also from a self-interest perspective to make sure that we understand what our costs might look like going forward. So I know David wants to jump in, so I'll stop there.
I'll jump in and just a couple of things. First of all, to
1
Graham.
minute, David. 1 minute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
me.
go ahead. 1 minute. You've got 1 minute.
Okay. To Graham, I wanted to say I violently agree with him. He'll be surprised to know that one of the biggest things I think that we've got to do is improve public transportation, and including e-bikes and a variety of those types of things. And especially with youth, my daughter thinks that transportation is in her cell phone and just wants an app that will tell her how to get there quickly. So that's the world in the city. But we can't treat the rest of Canada as flyover country. I mean, those are our customers as well. So we're going to have solutions, certainly in the transportation area, for pickup trucks and things that people need, because Canadians, I find an observation, often don't like to change, and we're just going to have to get changing in terms of SMEs and helping them change. There is a pretty good Canada 100% capital write-down if you buy an electric vehicle right now. So everybody can go out and buy 10 electric vehicles. That would be a good thing. My problem is I need to give you 10 affordable electric pickup trucks. I'm working on it. We'll get them soon.
All right, David, we are out of time, but clearly, given this pent up, desire to continue this conversation, and I'm noticing, comments associated with we need to say more, we need to do more, we need to dig deeper. These conversations need to happen, and they need to happen with the perspectives, the differing perspectives that I hope you have experienced today with our panelists. Panelists, you've done a terrific job. Thank you so much. And I wish we did have more time to be able to listen to your perspectives and have you talking to each other the way you did. I am very grateful for how well you did in such limited time. Very quickly, I was also noticing the digger deeper, the questions around regional data. This report that Climate Choices has issued has a slew of regional data in support of the overall high-level report that we released. And we do plan on doing some additional work. We certainly are committed to leveraging the data, the information that we were able to generate as we release this particular report. I think it served its purpose. It generated conversation. So on that note, we are out of time. I'm going to now punt it back to Elizabeth. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Kathy, thank you so much. Thank you again to all of our panelists, our speakers, and a special thank you to all of our attendees this morning, this afternoon. The engagement, it's so fantastic to see you, as Kathy said, engaging with one another, engaging with the speakers. We had so many wonderful questions, and with such a short amount of time, we could not get to all of them. Globe will be working with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices to do our best to compile some answers to the unanswered questions, so we'll be working on that. I do want to just quickly ask you to, maybe we'll flip up that final poll just to see if any perspectives have shifted. And we're just going to give you a quick 10-15 seconds. Has your perspective shifted in terms of what do you see as the most important priorities for Canada? I heard and saw through the chat that perhaps this doesn't capture everything, and that's been great. Even that has been a great takeaway for me. So we'll quickly collect the answers to that poll, and and thank you for doing that. So we have seen a bit of shifting there, Kathy, interestingly, in terms of perspectives on what's most important. So with that, we are at the top of the hour. I do want to let you know that coming up April 13th to 15th, you can join Globe and our community of sustainability practitioners and thought leaders at Globe Capital, which is focused on how do we finance a more sustainable and resilient future in Canada and around the world. I will invite you also to please share your feedback on this event. When you click to leave the event, you will have the opportunity to fill out a survey, and we take that input very meaningfully. Thank you again. Thank you to Kathy, to the Institute. Thank you to our speakers and to all of you. I wish you a wonderful day. Stay safe and stay hopeful.